Omsk Ambulance Hospital number 1. Outside, protesters and security agents. Inside, in a coma, Alexei Navalny, President Putin's most hated opponent. Poisoned? Surely not. Maybe he has a metabolic disease.
Из тех исследований, которые были выполнены, ядов не выявлено в крови или в моче, ядов или следов их пребывания в организме. Поэтому в настоящее время диагноз отравления, наверное, он где-то остается в подкорке нашего сознания, но мы не считаем, что пациент перенес отравление.
This morning, an air ambulance from a German charity landed, much to the frustration of Navalny's wife, who wasn't allowed to see her husband or the German doctors. At first, the hospital authorities wouldn't let their patient travel.
Отдать Алексея, чтобы отправить. Мы считаем, конечно, что это сделано для того, чтобы химическое вещество, которое находится в организме Алексея, исчезло. Поэтому его, конечно, не выдают, чтобы эти остатки этого вещества исчезли. Он в не очень хорошем состоянии, и мы, конечно, не можем доверять этой больнице, и мы требуем, чтобы его нам выдали, и мы смогли лечить его в независимой больнице, врачам которой мы доверяем.
But the German doctors who examined Navalny said he was well enough to fly to Berlin, and by the end of the day the Russians grudgingly agreed. Heavies outside the hospital obstructed Navalny's colleagues at every turn, even though the Kremlin said yesterday that they wished Navalny well. Yesterday, Navalny drank a cup of tea at Tomsk airport, and a short while later, mid-flight, was taken desperately ill. Other passengers could hear his agonized groans. The plane made an unscheduled landing in Omsk, and he was whisked to hospital already unconscious. Navalny has tried to challenge Putin in elections and gained a large following by exposing corruption at the highest levels of Russian politics. Hence the widespread belief that he was poisoned.
We are very worried about Alexei Navalny's health. Following his suspected poisoning yesterday, we wish him a swift and full recovery. We expect a swift, independent, transparent investigation. And if confirmed, those responsible must be held to account.
A Kremlin spokesman said today that toxicology reports will take some time. But protesters in St. Petersburg drew their own conclusion. Don't drink the tea.
Well, joining me now is Vladimir Karmuza. He's Vice President of the Free Russia Foundation, an organisation opposed to Vladimir Putin's government. Thanks very much for joining us this evening. Russian doctors treating Mr Navalny are saying, perhaps predictably, there is no poison in his body. The Kremlin is saying this had nothing to do with them. What's your assessment?
Well, that's exactly what they say every time. If you look at what's been happening in the 2 decades now that Vladimir Putin has been in power in our country, you see a whole slate of cases, both inside and outside of Russia, of course, prominently the Litvinenko and Skripal cases in the United Kingdom, of people who in some way or another have crossed the path of the Putin regime, have been subjected to poisoning attacks. Apart from the Skripal and Litvinenko case, there were many others too. I mean, Viktor Yushchenko, the former president of Ukraine, Yuri Shekachikhin, who died from mysterious poisoning in 2003, a prominent Russian investigative journalist and opposition MP. I was poisoned twice in 2015 and 2017, and on both occasions, doctors told my wife that I had about a 5% chance to live. So I'm very grateful to be able to be here and speaking with you today, and I really mean that. But every time in all of those poisoning cases, Kremlin spokesmen would come out and shrug their shoulders and say, oh, you know, it's nothing to do with us and nothing has been proven. Where is the proof, they would ask? I mean, of course, that's a question that is designed to have no answer, because the proof should come from independent investigations that Russian authorities refuse to allow. And I think it's high time to start calling a spade and start calling things for what they are. What happened to Alexei Navalny is a deliberate, politically motivated poisoning attack motivated by his activity in the Russian opposition.
If indeed, as you say, this is a deliberate poisoning, why now?
I don't think it's a question of timing, it's a question of who and how. Alexei Navalny is the most prominent, the most effective, frankly, the most dangerous political opponent of Vladimir Putin's regime. He is engaged, as you know, in many high-profile and prominent anti-corruption investigations directed at people in Putin's close circle. And in terms of how, again, the poisoning method has been a favored method of Soviet and then Russian security services going back decades, long before Putin, of course, back in the 70s, with, for example, the poisoning of Georgy Markov in London as well. It's not just poison. This week marks 2,000 days from the murder of Boris Nemtsov, the Russian opposition leader and former deputy prime minister who was gunned down literally in front of the Kremlin walls. And to this day, the organizers and masterminds of that assassination continue to be fully shielded and fully protected by the Russian state.
And of course, as you know, the Kremlin deny involvement in all of these incidents. But you yourself, as you say, have been the victim of suspected poisoning attacks. This is a brutal method, make no mistake, of trying to intimidate, or even worse, your opposition, isn't it?
It's a sadistic method. I have to say, as someone who unfortunately has experience with this, it's excruciating pain. It is very painful to have to go through this. And then if you're fortunate enough to survive, as I was, and as I hope to God Alexei will be as well, you will then spend months and months trying to get back to some sort of normality. I mean, I had to learn to walk again after the first poisoning, because once you're in a coma for such a long time, your body just basically gives up. So yes, apart from everything else, it is a sadistic method. It's also supposed to give the Kremlin this plausible deniability when they say, oh, we had nothing to do with this. Again, let's call a spade. Let's not fall for these Kremlin propaganda lies.
And very, very briefly, if you would, we know there are pressures on Mr Putin facing protests in his own country, and what is happening in neighbouring Belarus will be unnerving for him, won't it?
Absolutely. And if you look at the trends in Russian public opinion in recent weeks and months, it is absolutely clear that a lot of people in Russia now are fundamentally opposed to the Putin regime, especially among the young generation. And as you mentioned, there have been for weeks now ongoing protests in Khabarovsk, in Russia's Far East. And yes, what's happening in Belarus is important too, because, the regimes of Lukashenko and Putin, the last two dictatorships in Europe, are very similar to each other. And they kind of feed off each other and interdepend on each other in important ways. So what's happening in Belarus today, where there's a mass anti-authoritarian uprising, may well repeat itself on the streets of Russian cities down a few years' time, and that is why Putin is so worried as well.
We're going to come to exactly that right now, but thank you very much for talking to us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, in Belarus, the opposition leader who fled after the elections has called for protesters to continue their campaign to remove the long-term president Alexander Lukashenko. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is currently in Lithuania, has called for the elections to be held again. Other opposition figures inside the country have been summoned by authorities for interrogation. Our reporter has this from the capital, Minsk.
Вы запугали диктатуру. Она дрожит от страха перед вами, вашей силой и мужеством.
Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the woman who never even meant to become a politician, now seen by many as the next president of Belarus, calling for her compatriots to keep on protesting, to keep the pressure on.
Ведь если мы будем все вместе, у этого режима не останется ни единого шанса.
Yet her call for now comes from neighbouring Lithuania, where she fled like many others within her camp after pressure from the authorities back home. Today she called again for new, free and fair elections, but would not be drawn into directly calling out Russia for backing President Lukashenko.
I call for all the countries to respect the sovereignty of our country and to respect the choice of our people.
Are you afraid, though, for your well-being?
I think that every person in our country feels fear and is scary now, but it's our mission to step over all our fears and move further.
Doing just that was another leading woman of Belarus, Maria Kolesnikova, the last of the troika of female oppositions still in the country. In the opposition's unassuming headquarters in Minsk today, Kolesnikova sat alongside Pavel Latushko, a former minister and theatre director who was sacked last week after joining mass protests following the disputed election. Both are part of the newly formed Opposition Coordination Council, which hopes to carve out a new path for Belarus. Despite receiving threats, Latushko says he has no plans to leave.
We will continue our job. We will propose dialogue. Very important to understand that it's internal case, internal sphere of Belarus, and only Belarusian people can solve this political crisis.
In Minsk today, Members of the opposition council were summoned for interrogation after authorities opened a criminal case against them, accusing them of attempting to seize power. But could that pressure have the opposite effect? For years boasting an invincible air, President Lukashenko now appears rattled. Once loyal allies have heckled his speeches, and he has threatened a ruthless crackdown on any further protests. Despite the warnings, more mass demonstrations are planned for this weekend. The streets of Minsk, at least, appear unwilling to be silenced.